Okay, so end of the Cold War. C. This is the last lecture. So take a deep breath. Roll up your sleeves. Slap your neighbor. Dance a jig. Laugh at a bad joke. This is the last one for the year, just like that. The end of the Cold War. So this is the end of this unit, and this is the last unit. And then you take the test on Tuesday of next week, and then we move on to the final exam. So then, what we're going to do today is talk about how the Cold War ended. So to begin with, Gorbachev and Glasnost. In 1985, the Soviet Union got a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. That's the Russian version of Michael, obviously. I hope it's obvious. Who's this? This guy. Do you remember? The dude and the one dude and the other guy in that one place, that one time? I'm making fun of you. Can you be more specific? Well,
isn't it Khrushchev?
Nikita Khrushchev. He was the Soviet premier during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay? Leonid Brezhnev. This guy? No, this one's more like Sheehan. Yes, I can see that. Brezhnev doesn't look like anybody. Largest eyebrows in all of human history. Who's that? No. That's Richard Nixon. I didn't show you this the other day, I don't think, did I? Remember I said that Nixon visited communist China? He's the first American president to do that ever. Here's a picture of it. This is a major event in world history in the Cold War. Nixon, he was the one who was, no, he wasn't actually impeached. He resigned first. That's Mikhail Gorbachev. It's a birthmark. So, distinctive birthmark. Otherwise, normal-looking man, except for the big red blotch on his forehead. What is it with funky-looking Soviet leaders? Anyway, 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the new leader of the Soviet Union, and he's going to put into place some changes. He's a reformer. Okay? We talked a little bit about this in the previous lecture, about how the Cold War was beginning to change in, say, the late 60s and 70s. From the American point of view, remember it was Nixon who was pushing a policy of détente, which is an attempt to ease tensions, to bring things down a little bit, make them a little bit more calm, slightly more friendly. No hugging and singing Kumbaya, but at least some talking to each other from the American point of view, starting in 1969. From the Russian point of view, this continues for a decade plus, but it continues even more with Gorbachev, who's a reformer. He wants to put into place some changes in the Soviet Union. And he announced, along those lines, a policy of glasnost. I think that's on your sheet. Yes, it is. Glasnost, a Russian word meaning openness. 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 Doesn't always have a hyphen. You can do it that way too. Pretty simple. Openness. Remember, the Soviet Union, all communist systems, nations, are closed by nature. Okay, the Soviet Union had been a closed society, a fundamentally unfree one, where a prison state it's sometimes described as. People are not free to come and go as they wish. They are not free to watch whatever TV they want or read whatever books or listen to whatever music. Okay? Their society is shut down. People from the outside are not invited to see and know what's happening inside. So glasnost, that's why openness is a big deal. That's a change for the Soviet Union. They're going to, under Gorbachev's leadership, try to open things up a bit more, open their society up. For example, the government, under glasnost, the policy, would allow churches to open. You may not know this, but religion was essentially banned in the Soviet Union from the very beginning. Communism hates religion. Communism is atheistic. Okay? Do not believe in God. And so churches had been persecuted and closed and not formally allowed under the communists for the entire history of the Soviet Union. So this is going to change. Churches will be allowed to open. Another example of glasnost is that dissidents, some dissidents, would be released from prison. A dissident is someone who expresses an opinion contrary to the government, let's say. And in unfree societies where you're not allowed to do that, doing that is dangerous. Doing that is rebellious. That makes you a dissident. Sometimes people in the United States like to claim they are dissidents. There's no such thing in the United States. Because I can say Obama is an asshole. I can say Trump is a jerk. I can say our mayor sucks. I can say whatever I want about our politicians. That's a beautiful thing. No such thing as a dissident in the United States. In the Soviet Union, there is. You say stuff like that, you end up in jail. Okay, so there are thousands, tens of thousands of people in Russia who were in jail for expressing opinions contrary to the government. They were released from prison. Openness. Previously banned books were allowed. Just to give you a nice idea of what glasnost would look like in practice. Churches were allowed to open. Dissidents were released from prison. Books that had been banned before were unbanned, were allowed to be published and read and sold. So this is kind of, it's like Gorbachev's little attempt at sort of détente, but internally, right? Not so much relations with the outside, but just how the Soviet system would be run. It would be run in a more open way. Gorbachev also introduced the idea of perestroika. Perestroika, another Russian term. Perestroika. Perestroika means economic restructuring. Economic restructuring. So a change to the economic system of the Soviet Union. Right? We know communism is a system that does not believe in private property, that hates competition and free markets, where the central state redistributes all wealth, where the government is totally controlled by the state. Gorbachev also wants to make some changes there as well, restructure the economy. So, along those lines, under the policy of perestroika, Gorbachev allowed some private business. That's a new thing. Communism does not typically allow, and the Russians had not allowed private business. Everything was state-run before. Now, private individuals. Again, on a small scale here, think. It's not total change. It's just a little bit of a change. Some private business was allowed. The managers of farms and factories would be allowed more power to make decisions. Under communism, every little decision about how a farm is run or a factory, what to pay people, what the hours are, how much to make, all the little decisions that go into running a factory or a farm, those used to be controlled by the government. Under perestroika, Gorbachev is saying the manager of the factory or the farm would get some opportunity to have some input and make decisions for themselves. So you see a loosening in a way of communist economics. What ends up happening is this loosening, Gorbachev didn't know this, but loosening in a way, opening Soviet society and economy a little bit, resulted in the whole thing collapsing. Okay, and it's because it was so weak, because all these other things are going on. It turns out to have been the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. Okay, communist collapse in Europe then. Let's look at what's going on in the rest of Europe. And here I want to go back actually. Oh, wait. So, Poland, first of all. Let's talk about what happened in Poland. Starting in around 1980, Poland had been starting to move toward reform as well. Okay, so this movement towards change doesn't just happen in the Soviet Union; it happens in other communist countries in Europe, including Poland. Poland began moving towards reform as well. The leader of reform, or the leading party of reform in Poland, was called Solidarity. That was the name of it was actually a labor union. A union of workers who were called Solidarity, and they were led by Lech Walesa. That's Lech Walesa right there, with his killer handlebar mustache. Okay, easy to recognize in pictures because of that. So Lech Walesa was the leader of this Polish labor union called Solidarity, and they become kind of a political party, and they are pushing for reforms. Remember, living in a communist country sucks. Pardon my bluntness, but it's horrible. People hate it. And they start to get sick of it, basically. And inside of Poland, they're like, come on, enough of this. And they really start pressing for change. And now, remember, that's dangerous in a communist country. The state in a communist country is not interested in what your opinions are, right? You know what they do to people who express their opinions? Dissidents. They throw them in jail. Or they shoot them in the back of the head. Or they turn them into slave laborers. So pushing for change in a communist country is a very brave revolutionary act. And that's what people are getting braver, basically, starting in the 70s and 80s. By 1990, in Poland, the Polish people had voted the Communist Party out of power, which in a way, like, it seems like for decades that wasn't even possible, okay? Because they would hold elections in communist countries sometimes, but they were fake elections where the outcome was already determined. Like, it'd be an election where there's one party on the ballot. You can only vote for communists. But the fact that they had pushed so hard that they were able to vote the Communist Party out of power shows just how much communism was breaking down in Poland. So the reason I mention this is that Poland is one of the leading countries of reform. They're one of the earliest nations to push for the end of communism in their own country. Okay, in Germany then, you also have Germany's going to be very important, right? They were at the epicenter of everything in the Cold War. Let's go back to the map here. The story of Germany and the collapse of communism there is, of course, in East Germany, which was the communist half of Germany. In East Germany in the 1980s, you started to see this interesting phenomenon where, remember, we talked about communist countries being closed, where people are not free to come and go as they please. This is a prison state. I know it's hard to wrap your mind around this idea that you can't leave. You literally can't leave. Men with guns will stop you. You're not allowed to. But the East Germans had been allowed to travel inside of communist countries, right? East Germans, look at the map up here, they could go to Poland if they wanted to, or Czechoslovakia, or whatever. They can stay inside the communist prison, but you just can't leave it. Well, what East Germans started to do was travel eastward into Hungary, and apparently the border controls in Hungary were not as strict. It was easier to get through the border in Hungary. So they'd go to Hungary and then they'd leave Hungary and go to West Germany. They'd go around like the Berlin Wall and sneak into West Germany. More and more and more East Germans start doing this. You ever heard of this concept of voting with your feet? Think about it. That's the East German people voting with their feet. That's them. It's the ultimate expression of what they want. What do they want? They don't want to be in East Germany, right? They're expressing their hatred for the communist system that is in place in East Germany. How do we know that's their opinion? Because they vote with their feet. They literally leave, right? You couldn't make a more strong statement, right? What's a better place to live, Cuba or Florida? Florida. How do we know that? Because people risk their lives to leave Cuba to go to Florida. Cannot possibly have a stronger statement than that. That's it. That's proof. Similar sort of thing here in East Germany. So the government gets wind of it. They realize what's happening. They start to crack down. They completely close the border, including the Berlin Wall. It used to be possible that if you had a special permit, you could pass back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Not across it, but through it, basically through gates. They shut that down completely, locked down East Germany basically, like a prison that goes on lockdown. If you've ever seen a prison movie. Protests broke out all over East Germany because of this, right? When the government cracks down, the people get even more rebellious. So there's unrest inside East Germany. In June of 1987, the American president, Ronald Reagan, went to June 1987. Ronald Reagan was in West Germany, in Berlin, in West Berlin, and he gave a speech, a famous speech, in which he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." You get what he's saying here? He's standing in front of the Berlin Wall. He's not in the Soviet Union, but he's speaking to the guy who's in charge of communism in Europe. He says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Let's end the Cold War. Let's remove the Iron Curtain." So as you can see, things really start to build momentum. By the end of 1989, in fact, in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed, both literally and metaphorically. The Berlin Wall. This is a photograph of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Protests had broken out on both sides of the wall, especially in West Berlin. And spontaneously, almost like, remember, these are things that like theoretically can't happen. In a totalitarian state that uses violence, you're not allowed to be free and to speak freely and to act freely. But communism had broken down so much that people start to say, you know what, screw it, we're going to do whatever we want. And people of Berlin just one day said, why are we allowing this anymore? And they went in spontaneously, again, without being directed. No one's telling them to do this. They just naturally start to go to the wall and they start tearing it down. Regular folks, like construction workers. Hey, Joe, go get the backhoe over there. You know, and he just drives up and they attach wires to it and they tear it down. So this is an unbelievable image. Those are East German soldiers standing on the other side of the wall, right, on the other side of the moon, it might as well have been. And then it's pulled, the concrete is pulled down, and you have all these free people on the West Berlin side saying, "Welcome, German brothers," right? Let's not be divided anymore. It's really amazing. They had a party, basically. This is a happy moment for the people of Germany. A spontaneous celebration broke out all the way into the night, right? They're jumping on top of the wall. Remember, a week before this, if you had gotten up on top of the Berlin Wall, what would have happened to you? You would have been shot by a guard in a tower with a gun nearby, attacked by German shepherds, right? But the German people say, nah, that's it, this is over. Crawl on top of the wall, they're blaring music, people are drinking champagne, it's a party, okay? They're celebrating the end of communism in Berlin, in the city of Berlin, in the nation of Germany, and as we can see, in all of Europe. It's all kind of happening at the same time. By the end of 1989, within like a month and a half here, the East German Communist Party ceased to exist. The East German Communist Party, by the end of 1989, was no more. There was no Communist Party, which is the same way of saying there was no communist government in East Germany by the end of 1989. Germany was officially reunited on October 3rd, 1990. October 3rd, 1990. Germany was officially reunited so that there is no East Germany and West Germany as of October 3rd, 1990. There's only one Germany. Think about this if going back to the end of World War II. This is like finally Germany is made whole again. Okay, it was split after World War II, and it's finally put together again. Communist regimes then in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Yugoslavia all fell by 1991. That's not 1991. 1991. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia by 1991. And we already talked about Poland, right? So you can see it's almost like, dominoes falling in a sense, but in reverse, right? It's like domino theory, but in reverse. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, all the communist governments there all fell by 1991. So then that brings us to the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union. On August 8th, 1991, a group of communists in the Soviet Union, what they call hardline communists, that is hardcore communists, people who are committed, generals, high-ranking government officials, the heads of the KGB, the people in power who are hardcore dedicated to communism and to keeping their own power, attempted a coup. A coup is an overthrow of the government. C-O-U-P, not coup. Coup. Pronounced coup. They arrested this small group of hardline communists, arrested Gorbachev and demanded his resignation. Okay, a coup. This coup was an attempted overthrow of the state. They're trying to take over the government back from Gorbachev, basically. We're going to get rid of this guy and take over the government again and make sure it stays communist. That's the idea here. So they arrest Gorbachev. They demand that he resigns. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Moscow is the capital. So the Soviet army was ordered to move into Moscow to take it over. This is what happens in coups often, is the military has to be involved, right? Because they're using force. But then you have these famous scenes. I need to get pictures of this. I don't have any. I'll get some maybe later. You have these amazing scenes where like crowds are gathering. It's kind of like Berlin, where these things are happening spontaneously, where huge numbers of Russian people are in the streets in Moscow, and you have protesters, some of them are backing the communists, and everybody's confused and what the hell's going on here, because really everything's kind of collapsing all around them. It's a revolutionary moment. The tanks roll in, and then you have this famously a man named Boris Yeltsin, who started talking to the drivers of the tanks, the soldiers. And he was able to convince the soldiers not to attack, right? Not to back the coup. Instead, to side with him, and because he's a reformer too. So, in other words, the coup failed. The reformers were able to prevent the hardline communists from taking over, and that meant that communism itself was going to fall in the Soviet Union right away, which is basically what happened. Shortly after these famous scenes, the Communist Party itself collapsed, and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. And the Cold War was over, just like that. It's amazing. So if you think back to it, in a way you could say it starts in 1980 with Solidarity, but really like maybe 1987, when Gorbachev gives that speech. Within 4 years, the whole thing, the red on the map, gone as a communist systems. So it happened very, very quickly. Like a building, like the implosions of buildings where they bring them down, right? You have the explosions down at the bottom, and the building looks like it's standing, like a second or two after the explosions, and then whoosh, it all goes down. That's sort of like how this thing collapsed, very, very suddenly. Okay, questions about that? The end of world history.